During this Math Minute, we will be connecting Focus Skills, STAR, and Dreambox. The goals of this session are to connect the STAR Math Assessment data, the Wake County Public Schools prioritize focus skills in math, and Dreambox for strategic progress monitoring. Let's watch a clip presented by Annalisa Bailey from the October Instructional Facilitators meeting.
All right, so getting into the flow chart that we talked about earlier, when we review student data, we have to keep those three elements that Crystal described and reviewed for us in mind. Is the skill we're looking at critical? Is it impactful? And is it also standards-based? So the first thing we wanted to look at is what is our existing guidance around math intervention? And this can be found on the K-8 Math MTSS flowchart. And I think Kimberly just dropped the link in the chat for you there. So if you haven't opened that yet, it is there for you. And it's exactly the same document we shared with you last year. This document can be found about halfway down on the flowchart under the intervention resource section, and it's the very first link. It's called Guidance for Math Intervention. And it contains information on the evidence-based instructional practices for math intervention and the priority focus skills for math intervention. So the priority focus skills are the areas that are most critical and most impactful, you're going to hear those words a lot today, to advance the learning progression for student understanding of math content. And these are the areas that connect, as Crystal said, and they radiate up for student understanding and they radiate down to the majority of the work that students are going to do in K-8 math. And we want to think of these priority skills like big buckets. They can hold a lot of smaller specific skills that we can unpack and explore, but they are the most critical and impactful in helping students move forward in their learning and understanding. So as you look at this chart, you want to think about the current grade level that the student is in. So if they're enrolled in third grade, you want to think about third grade standards. And the priority focus skill associated with their grade band is where you want to start. So if I'm thinking about a second grader, I want to look at that K3 band. If I'm thinking about a fifth grader, I want to look at a 4-6 band. And if you're a middle school IC or ITF and you've got like a seventh grader, you want to look at that 7th and 8th grade band. And then the priority focus skill associated with that grade band is where you want to start because that will be the most impactful area. And we'll take a closer look at how all this works in our next section. So when you look at K3, you will see areas like place value and addition and subtraction, which makes sense because that's where students in those grade levels spend the majority of their instructional time. And then when you move into 4th through 6th grade, the work shifts a little bit and students use that knowledge of place value and addition and subtraction and move into solving problems with multiplication division. And then they use all that knowledge of addition and subtraction and whole numbers to now work with fractions and then move into doing operations with those fractions. So these are the areas that we would want to focus on first if the student is in one of those grade levels. So as we prepare to think about our STAR screener results, you first want to think about these big buckets or priority focus skills, and then consider what kinds of skills would I expect students to develop as part of that prioritized area. So if I choose addition and subtraction, and if I see that come up on my report, then I can think about, okay, what little pieces would be associated with this big priority focus skill? And we're going to take a look at that next. So a note about data. Some of you have been to our day 2 training and are familiar with pulling all this data, and some of you haven't yet, and that is okay. That's great. We've got you covered today. So for the next part, we're going to go through 2 sets of data from something called the STAR Instructional Planning Report. So if you haven't seen that yet, no worries. We will go over it with you in day 2 of the synchronous training. If you have, then great. You know exactly the report we're talking about. But for today, we have pulled the data sets. So all you have to do is focus on the process of making instructional decisions and really get how does that feel and how do I talk about these skills so you can take it back to your PLTs and use this practice to really inform your instruction. And when you look at those reports with your teams, then you can start to make sense of those reports. As you look at the focus skills, we want to remember that this data helps to tell the story of a student. So when I used to work in my building with PLTs or intervention teams, I would like to usually start our meetings by asking the question of, tell me about the student. What is their story? What do we know about them? And as you keep that data in that context of what is the story of this student, we can begin to see the learning progression and the pathway to best support this particular student. I know when we look at a whole bunch of these, it's easy to get into almost a formula, if you will, of they're showing multiplication, so we pick this skill. But really, as we think about it, we want to keep our particular student story in mind, especially with a year like this one. So as we keep our student stories in mind, when we're going to look at their data, we're going to go back and think about the most critical, impactful, and standards-based. You're also going to keep those priority focus skills in mind. You can use those guiding questions. So you're going to keep all that in mind. I know it's a lot. We're going to practice. And then as you unpack the student's data and look at their STAR data, you also want to use it alongside the other data that you may have about the student and know about the student to consider all the pieces about what would be the next best instructional move for this student. So we're going to work through this together in a couple sample sets, and then you're going to get to try on your own. So we're going to use all three of these pieces together as we look at some data. Crystal or Daniel, are there any questions in the chat? I'm going to pause right there because that was a lot.
There is not yet, Annalisa. I think we can keep on rolling.
All right. So let's look at some data together. All right, so as we do this work, if you were an IF or you were with us back in our February meeting, that seems like a very long time ago, but we walked you through a very similar work where we did some case studies, and you may have seen some pictures of the EAT team members when we were younger. This work's going to feel very similar. The only difference is this time we have the STAR report. So we didn't have the STAR report when we tried to do this work with Dreambox back in February, but now we have the gift, if you will, of the STAR report. So we can go in and it will help us more fine tune and align our instruction for our students. So this is a fourth grade student. It is actual data. And as we look at this student's data, we want to think about, the first question is about what is the trend that I see across this data set? So I know if he's a fourth grader and I'm thinking about those priority focus skills, I should start looking for maybe multiplication, maybe division, maybe fractions. I'm going to pause for a minute and let you just read through the focus skills. And these came right off of his instructional planning report from STAR. So I just want you to read through those, and we'll pause for a second. So as I look at this data, there's a couple of things to note on this page. You will see at the top, the domains listed there. So you see operations and algebra. You see numbers and operations in base 10, and then you see fractions. So you see those same domains that we're very familiar with around the standards. And then underneath that, you see a very important sentence that says this score suggests this student is ready for instruction and practice with the skills listed under that domain. And as I look at this, I need to remember that this doesn't mean that this student necessarily doesn't have additional things, maybe below third grade, that they could use support with. But what this report is telling me is that this is that most impactful spot where I could start with this student to really help them do that growth that we were talking about earlier. So these are the skills, if you want to get, as Crystal said, the biggest bang for your buck, this is where you would want to start to help moving them both towards the fourth grade content he's working with, and also to fill in some of those missing Jenga pieces, if you will. So as I look at his data, I can start to see some words or trends start to pop up here. I see multiply, I see divide, I see equations, I see multiples of 10, I see basic facts, and I think about things like fluency, and the fluency not meaning memorization, but thinking about, is he efficient? Is he accurate? Is he using strategies to solve those problems? So I'm starting to see a lot of trends around multiplication and division, which lines up with that priority focus skill for that student. And as I think about what he might need, just because I chose multiplication division, I'm also seeing things like equal groups and basic facts. And I would say that this student would be early on in his understanding of multiplication and division. So I might need to think about third grade supports for him. And we'll talk about how to do that in the next part. But for right now, I'm just thinking, okay, multiplication and division is where I'm going to work for this student. All right, that's our first one. We're going to try one more. So now we have a fifth grader. Same idea. He's just like I did with the other student. I'm starting with his priority focus skills, and I'm going to remember that he's a fifth grader. So I'm thinking about either multiplication or division or fractional understanding. So I'm going to pause, and I want you to just look across that data for a minute and start thinking about where you might support the student. And as you look at his data, you're going to see that number 3 over there, and that is the recommended grade level. But he may also need to go down to those 3rd grade skills. But the shortcut isn't just to drop him back and say, I'm going to teach him everything in 3rd grade, but it's rather what are the specific skills and strategies that I can pull up from 3rd grade to help him access 5th grade. And because I, again, want to keep that most impactful skill in mind. So I know where I think I would start with him, but if you will just drop in the chat which priority focus skill you would start with for him based on what you're seeing in this report. If you'll just drop it in the chat. Let's see what you all think. I see multiplication and division. Lots of multiplication and division. Yes, and I see someone just put just multiplication, and you could focus on multiplication, but the nice thing about his focus skills is that I see multiplication and division, and if I work on one, then I can also work on the opposite, so that inverse relationship between the two. It's kind of like when we teach addition, we talked about how to put them together, and with subtraction, we're going to talk about how to take them apart. It's that same idea with multiplication and division. So that's the nice thing about those priority focus skills is they give us a nice broad bucket to work in. So I don't just confine myself to just multiplication, but I can work on both at the same time. So as I'm looking at his data, I also see equal groups. I also see fluently working within 100 to multiply and divide and determining the unknown. So this student is a little bit further along than our 4th grader that we looked at. And so I might want to think about how his learning progression is a little bit different. He might need a little different set of scaffolds and supports than my 4th grader did. And again, we're going to look at all this in a minute. But as you look at the data and as you look at more and more of these students, you're going to start saying, this student has similar needs to this student. So maybe I could group them. Maybe I could do some flex grouping. Maybe I can, if I give these supports in 4th grade, then when I meet with the 5th grade team, maybe we can have the same kinds of conversations. So it's just getting familiar with what are the trends in the data as I think about sort of these big buckets of multiplication and division.
The key takeaways from this video are that the focus skills are the most foundational skills that students need to master in order to move forward with more complex concepts. The STAR Instructional Planning Student Report will highlight the skill level in each math domain. When looking at STAR math data, be sure to keep your focus skills sheet handy so that it may assist you in determining the most foundational skill identified by STAR and its grade level band. When thinking about your work with a focus skill in the area of addition and multiplication, it is wise to keep the inverse operation in mind. Let's continue our work in connecting the focus skills with STAR Math and Dreambox. This portion is presented by Daniel Greco.
The previous work you completed earlier with Annalisa allowed you to identify appropriate focus skills that would be most critical and impactful to advance the learning progression for both that 4th grade student and 5th grade student that you examined previously. So we're going to use those focus skills now to link them to Dreambox standards where we can begin to narrow that support. So you're kind of trying to find that trend now to kind of narrow it in to help students close gaps and then also gain access to core instruction through long-term assignments. Go and click for me. So when you look at this standards report, you'll notice there's grade banded across the top. And then also, if you go in and you click on a specific grade band, like in this case, 3rd grade, you'll see North Carolina, because it's on North Carolina State standards, not the Dreambox units, North Carolina State standards from that grade are going to appear. Just for this slide, we just took screenshots of OA and MBT standards because those linked to the focus skill domains you were working with earlier today with the 4th and 5th grader. We can go to the next one. So I want to kind of return us back to that 4th grade student from earlier. This student, you identified for this student, they're in beginning multiplication and division as the focus skills that we believe to be most impactful, okay, and that are most critical. And because we know as we move into 4th through 6th grade, We're going to be applying foundational skills to solve problems with multiplication and division, along with developing concepts around fractions. But for this particular fourth grader, we're going to hone in on the multiplication and division based on the focus skills that were identified. So we're going to pull up the student's third grade standards report from the standards report in Dreambox. And first, to reiterate a previous point Annalisa made, that it does not mean the student doesn't have deficits below third grade. I know all the focus skills say third grade. We have to keep in mind we're looking for what's most impactful and what's going to provide the student with what they are ready for next. So STAR guided us to look at third grade content, and based on the analysis y'all did earlier, more specifically, we're going to focus on operations and algebraic thinking and numbers and operations in base 10. Looking at the OA standards, the operations and algebraic thinking for this fourth grade student, their data is telling us a story. And it kind of leads me to believe OA6, understanding properties of multiplication and the relationship between that multiplication and division, might be a good starting point. This would be a good entry point because they have 8% progress, so they've started this objective. However, they're not approaching mastery yet. They're not getting close to that 80%. And at 8% proficient, we can assume the student might require some support around this standard. Also, OA6 encompasses the direction the focus skills we're suggesting and pulling on asking the student to draw on their knowledge of both multiplication and division. So for this student, the fourth grader, probably would link those focus skills to OA6 for a long-term assignment. I want to look on to the fifth grader and kind of do the same process. Again, we got to keep in mind the priority focus skills of multiplication and division and fractional understanding are still going to apply. This student, we identified multiplication up to 100, multiplication and division up to 100, as the focus skill we believe will be most critical and impactful. And we know the student seems to be a little further ahead in the learning progression for multiplication and division than fourth grader. However, it's still appropriate that we look back to third grade. Being the focus skills are informing us, that's where we're going to have the most impact for the student. With these focus skills in mind, we'll pull up the student's third grade standards report again. We're still going to be looking at that OA, operations and algebraic thinking, and numbers and operations in base 10 once again. OA6, still kind of standing out here, understanding those properties of multiplication and the relationship between multiplication and division. Probably a good selection because the student already has some progress in OA1 and they're proficient in OA2. And this is interpreting factors and quotients and illustrating strategies, which are prerequisites leading into this OA6 that they already have a little bit of work in. But OA6 is going to give us a bigger bang for our buck, be more impactful, while the student builds that relationship between multiplication and division. Also, not to mention, fluency, the OA7 piece, is going to kind of naturally continue to expand as they progress through these and become more aware of strategies as they're working. So we got two students with OA6, the fourth and fifth grader, but for a little different reason. Go to the next one for me. Thank you. So this was brought up over the break. Whenever we go in to make a long-term assignment, we have some options. We could pick standards, North Carolina State standards, clusters, or Dreambox units. It depends on the students and the students' data, to be honest. Okay, I want to stress something before we look at these three. There's no getting it wrong, because as long as you're making database decisions, then we know we're doing what's right for students and progressing them along with mathematics. So first, I want to look at standards. A more narrow focus. They might complete the assignment ahead of schedule, but that's fine. You'll just go back into your data, pick another, standard to focus on, make a new assignment. The standards is a good option if you're looking at an isolated area of need, something more narrow that the student needs to complete, or if you know they're at the beginning of a learning progression for one of the focus areas. Another consideration could be the clusters. Still a pretty small area of focus, might be the most helpful choice when students are within the cluster, when there's interconnection within the cluster, and when work with the entire cluster might help increase access to what's happening in core. Or when you notice that the student is already in progress with most standards inside of that cluster. And then lastly, but not least, the Dreambox unit. This is choosing a broader category of learning. Great choice for interconnected standards, concepts that will increase across the core. Another time you might want to consider this, and also for concepts that overlap or spiral across grade levels.
The key takeaways from this video are that Dreambox is an instructional response to the data dig into the STAR report and the focus skills. Progress monitoring on student growth towards mastery cannot be achieved in Dreambox without assigning a long-term assignment. Dreambox units should be assigned at the level indicated in the STAR Instructional Planning Student Report. Assigning Dreambox units to students based on their focus skill area of need will ensure that students have enough content for a long-term assignment. So what's the bottom line? The bottom line is when planning to support students using the data from the STAR Instructional Planning Student Report, it is important to keep in mind the prioritized math focus skills. The STAR Instructional Planning Student Report can help determine the grade level band and skill to work on in Dreambox. Students must have a long-term assignment in Dreambox for progress monitoring to work effectively. Special Education Services Math recommends assigning students long-term assignments that encompass the entire band or the Dreambox units. If you have any questions or would like to discuss this information further, please do not hesitate to contact our office.